The crystal champagne flute felt unnaturally cold in Eleanor's hand, a stark contrast to the burning heat rising in her cheeks. Across the table, her husband of 15 years, Julian Vance, swirled his vintage Bordeaux, the ruby liquid catching the light of the chandelier overhead. This was Aria, the city's most exclusive restaurant, a place for hushed celebrations and monumental deals. Tonight it was supposed to be for them, for their anniversary. But as Julian looked at her, his eyes, once full of warmth, held only the cool, dismissive glint of a man assessing a depreciating asset. He was about to speak, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this single night would either save their marriage or shatter it into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. The silence at their corner table in Aria was a physical entity as thick and heavy as the velvet drapes that framed the panoramic view of the city skyline. It was their 15th wedding anniversary, a milestone that was supposed to be marked with shared smiles and tender reminiscences. Instead, the air crackled with unspoken resentment. Julian Vance, a man sculpted by success and tailored by Savile Row, finally broke the quiet. He didn't look at his wife Eleanor, but rather at the sprawling metropolis below a kingdom he felt he had conquered. 15 years, he said, the words clipped and devoid of sentiment. It's a long time to be with one person, an eternity in the modern age. Eleanor's heart, which had been fluttering with a fragile hope all evening, sank. She had spent 2 hours getting ready, choosing a classic navy dress, the one he used to love, styling her honey blonde hair in soft waves. She'd done it for him, for them, for the memory of the young couple who had once believed an eternity together wouldn't be long enough. "It doesn't have to feel that way, Julian," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. "We've built a life, a family. We have Daniel and Sophie." He finally turned his gaze to her, and the dismissal in his eyes was a physical blow. "Yes, we have. And I provide for them. I provide for you. You have a beautiful home, a luxury SUV, a black Amex with no limit. What more could you possibly want?" The transactional nature of his words stung. He spoke of their life as if it were a balance sheet where he had fulfilled his obligations, and she was a line item under expenses. She remembered the early days living in a tiny apartment, eating pasta on the floor, because they couldn't afford a dining table. He was a junior developer, then full of dreams, and she was a promising young architect who put her own career on hold to support his. She'd drafted his first business plans, networked at boring industry events, and raised their children while he built his real estate empire, Vance Holdings. He seemed to have forgotten that their foundation wasn't built on his money, but on their shared sacrifice. "I want my husband back," she said, the words barely a whisper. "The man I married, the one who held my hand and told me we were a team." A cruel smirk played on Julian's lips. He took a slow sip of his wine, savoring it, before delivering his next verbal strike. "People change, Ellie. They evolve. I've spent the last 15 years climbing to the top. I'm a different man. I am different. Appetites." The implication hung in the air, suffocating her. She knew, of course. She wasn't a fool. The late nights at the office, the sudden intense secrecy with his phone, the scent of a perfume that wasn't hers, clinging to his suit jackets. She had chosen to ignore it, telling herself it was a phase, a midlife crisis, a symptom of the pressure he was under with his flagship project, the Odyssey Tower. But hearing him all but confess so callously on their anniversary was a new level of cruelty. "This new man," she began, trying to keep her voice steady. "Is he a better one?" Julian laughed, a short barking sound that made a nearby couple glance over. "Better he's a winner. He's at the top of his game. Look around, Ellie. This is my world now. I don't have time for sentimentality or nostalgia." He gestured vaguely at her simple, elegant dress, her understated pearl earrings. His gaze was an inventory, and she felt it found her wanting. "You know?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I was talking to my lawyer, Robert Carlyle, the other day. Just hypothetically, of course. We were discussing assets partnerships. He said something that stuck with me. He said that in business and in life, you have to know when to divest from assets that are no longer performing." The blood drained from Eleanor's face. He was comparing her to a failing stock. "And sometimes," he continued, pressing his advantage as he saw the hurt bloom in her eyes, "you have what they call a starter partner. The one who was there for the scrappy beginning, who was good enough for that phase. But when you reach a certain level, you need someone different, someone who fits the new brand, a finishing partner, if you will." Starter wife. The unspoken words echoed in the space between them. He was telling her she was obsolete, a relic of a past he was eager to shed. The waiter arrived, then a phantom of professional discretion, placing their entrees before them. A pan-seared sea bass for her, a bloody porterhouse steak for him. The food looked exquisite, a piece of culinary art, but the sight of it made Eleanor's stomach churn. She looked at Julian, who was already cutting into his steak with a surgeon's precision, his focus entirely on his plate. He had delivered the most devastating blow of their entire marriage and had already moved on to his dinner. There was no remorse, no flicker of doubt, just the old hard certainty of a man who believed he held all the cards. It was in that moment that the fragile hope she had carried into the restaurant finally died. It wasn't just about another woman anymore. It was about the complete and utter contempt he had for her, for their history, for the woman who had given him everything. The love was gone, replaced by a patronizing cruelty she could no longer ignore. She picked up her own knife, her knuckles white. He thought she was a non-performing asset, a sentimental starter wife to be cast aside. He had no idea of the strength she held, the resilience forged in the lonely years she had spent managing their life while he chased his ambition. He saw her as a silent partner. He was about to find out just how wrong he was. "You're right, Julian," she said, her voice clear and surprisingly firm. It made him look up from his steak, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "People do change, and I think I've been far too sentimental for far too long." She placed her napkin on the table, stood up, and looked down at him. Not with tears, but with a cold, clear focus he had never seen before. "Enjoy your dinner, and your new brand. I'm divesting." Without another word, she turned and walked out of Aria, leaving Julian momentarily stunned at their anniversary. Table, the city lights twinkling behind him like a constellation of hollow promises. The drive home was a blur of traffic lights and tear-streaked windshields. The valet had brought her Mercedes SUV around a car Julian had gifted her for her birthday last year, presenting the keys with a flourish at a dinner party. At the time, she'd felt a pang of unease. It felt less like a gift and more like part of a uniform, the wife of Julian Vance costume. Tonight, the plush leather interior felt like a cage. She stormed into their cold, minimalist mansion in the suburbs, the silence of the large, empty rooms amplifying the screaming in her head. Daniel and Sophie were with her parents for the weekend, a trip she had arranged to ensure her anniversary with Julian would be special. The irony was a bitter pill. For an hour, she paced the cavernous living room, a space filled with expensive art and designer furniture that held no warmth, no memory of family laughter. Julian's words echoed relentlessly. Starter wife. Non-performing asset. The humiliation burned away the grief, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. He wanted to discard her fine, but she would not walk away broken and penniless while he moved on to his finishing partner. Her background wasn't in finance, but architecture had taught her precision attention to detail and the importance of a solid foundation. She knew that the first step to building a new life was to understand the ground she was standing on. That meant understanding their finances. She went to Julian's home office, a sleek, intimidating room of glass and chrome that she rarely entered. His desktop computer was locked, but his high-end laptop sat on the credenza. She remembered the password, Odyssey 2025, the name of his legacy project, and the year of its planned completion. His arrogance was for once a gift. For the next few hours, Eleanor delved into a world she had long been excluded from. Bank statements, investment portfolios, credit card bills. It was a dizzying maze of numbers, but she was methodical. She was looking for the predictable, extravagant spending on hotels, flights, gifts. Proof of the affair that she could hand to a divorce lawyer. She found it easily enough. American Express statements detailed charges from florists. She'd never used reservations at restaurants he'd claimed to be visiting for client meetings, and a staggering number of purchases from high-end boutiques like Chanel and Cartier. It was a clear, vulgar trail of infidelity. She copied the files onto a secure USB drive, her hands shaking slightly with a mixture of anger and vindication. This was it. This was the ammunition she needed. But as she was about to close a folder labeled MISC, Project Invoices, something caught her eye. It was a wire transfer confirmation from one of their joint investment accounts. A payment of $75,000 was made 3 months ago. The recipient was a company she had never heard of, Rosso Corsa Designs, LLC. The memo line was unhelpfully vague, Consulting Services, ODY. ODI was clearly shorthand for the Odyssey Tower, but Vance Holdings had its own world-renowned interior design team on a multi-million-dollar retainer. Why would Julian be paying an unknown LLC $75,000 for consulting? She cross-referenced the name. No website, no public registration records she could easily access. It was a ghost. Then she saw another payment from 2 months ago, $50,000, and another just last month for $100,000. The amounts were irregular, not like a standard monthly retainer. It felt personal, driven by an instinct she couldn't explain. She went back to the Amex statements this time, ignoring the obvious signs of cheating. She searched for smaller, more specific clues. And then she found it. A charge from 6 months ago at a highly exclusive appointment-only jeweler in the city's most private district, Atelier Beaumont. The amount was eye-watering, $48,000. It was for a custom piece. The notes on the digital receipt specified the Izide pendant. She had never received such a pendant. She was sure of that. Who was inside? Was that a brand, a style, a person? She typed "inside pendant Atelier Beaumont" into the search engine. Nothing. It was a private commission. But then she tried a different approach. She searched social media, a world she usually disdained. She typed in hashtags related to Vance Holdings, the Odyssey Tower, and the glitzy charity galas Julian often dragged her to. She scrolled through hundreds of photos of smiling strangers in tuxedos and gowns. and then she froze. It was a photo from the Architects Guild Gala 2 months prior. Julian stood center frame, a confident smile on his face. Standing a little too close to him was a stunningly beautiful woman in a crimson dress. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with fiery red hair and an impossibly confident air. And there, resting against her collarbone, was a unique, intricate gold pendant crafted in the shape of an Egyptian ankh, with a single perfect ruby at its center. The caption on the photo, posted by some B-list society blogger, read, "Real estate mogul Julian Vance with the brilliant up-and-coming designer Isabella Rossi. What a dynamic duo." Isabella Rossi, the surname echoed in her mind. Rosso, as in Rosso Corsa Designs. Rosso Corsa was Italian for racing red, a nod to her fiery hair. It was a stretch, but the pieces began to click into place with an alarming, sickening logic. Isabella Rossi was the mistress. Rosso Corsa Designs was her shell company, a vehicle for Julian to funnel money to her under the guise of consulting. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea. He wasn't just cheating on her. He was using their joint funds, money she was legally entitled to pay his mistress a 6-figure salary. The audacity, the sheer unadulterated arrogance of it was breathtaking. But as she stared at the photograph, another detail pricked at her architect's eye. Isabella Rossi wasn't just looking at Julian with adoration. Her gaze was sharp, intelligent, and it was directed just past him, towards another man standing on the edge of the frame. He was partially obscured, but Eleanor recognized him instantly. It was Marcus Thorne. Thorne was Julian's arch-nemesis, his biggest competitor in the city's cutthroat real estate market. The two men despised each other with a passion that was legendary in the industry. They were currently locked in a brutal bidding war for the city's waterfront development rights, a project that would dwarf even the Odyssey Tower. Julian had spoken of Thorne with venom, calling him a vulture and a corporate parasite. Why was Isabella Rossi, Julian's mistress and secret consultant, looking at Marcus Thorne with such focused intensity? It wasn't a casual glance. It was the look of an operative assessing a target. Or perhaps a partner. A new, more terrible suspicion began to form in Eleanor's mind, cold and sharp as a shard of glass. This was no ordinary affair. The secret payments, the shell corporation. The connection, however fleeting, to his greatest rival. It felt like something far more complex and dangerous. Julian hadn't just underestimated his wife. He had, she suspected, profoundly and catastrophically underestimated his mistress. And Eleanor, the discarded starter wife, was the only one who had just caught a glimpse of the truth. She saved the photo, her mind racing the plan for a simple divorce evaporating, replaced by the chilling premonition of a much larger battle to come. The next few days were a masterclass in deception. Eleanor played the part of the wounded, withdrawn wife. When Julian finally came home from his hotel late the next day, he found her in the garden, listlessly pruning roses. He offered a hollow, half-hearted apology, blaming the stress of the Odyssey project for his unforgivable words. He didn't apologize for the affair, only for his cruelty in revealing it. "I was out of line, Ellie," he said, keeping a careful distance. "Let me make it up to you. A trip, maybe. Anywhere you want to go." She looked at him, her face a carefully constructed mask of sorrow. "I don't know, Julian. I need some time to think." "Of course," he said, relieved at her passive response. He thought her silence was weakness. Her request for time, a sign that she would eventually capitulate as she always had. He had no idea she was not just thinking. She was plotting. Her first call was not to a divorce lawyer, but to an old friend from her university days, a woman named Clara Jensen. Clara had been a brilliant investigative journalist before burning out and starting her own private investigation firm, specializing in discreet corporate and marital cases. She was sharp, cynical, and fiercely loyal. They met in a quiet cafe far from the prying eyes of their social circle. Eleanor laid it all out. The dinner the starter wife comment, the Amex statements, the wire transfers to Rosso Corsa designs, and finally the photograph of Isabella Rossi looking at Marcus Thorne. Clara listened intently, her sharp eyes missing nothing. When Eleanor was finished, she took a slow sip of her coffee. "Well," Clara said, her voice dry. "Julian isn't just a cheat. He's a cliché. Paying the mistress through a shell company is straight out of the idiot adulterer's handbook, chapter 3. But the Thorne angle, that's interesting. That's a thread worth pulling." Eleanor leaned forward. "I don't want to just divorce him, Clara. He's trying to erase me, to label me as some starter project he's outgrown. He's using our money to fund his new life. And this woman, there's something more to her. I can feel it." "So what's the objective?" Clara asked, all business now. "Maximum pain or maximum men? Why not both?" Eleanor replied, a sliver of steel in her voice that made Clara raise an eyebrow in appreciation. For the next week, Clara's firm went to work. They were ghosts in the machine, running background checks, tracing digital footprints and conducting surveillance. Eleanor, meanwhile, continued her performance at home. She was quiet, melancholy, and non-confrontational, lulling Julian into a false sense of security. He became brazen, leaving his laptop open, taking calls with Isabella in the next room, assuming his wife was too heartbroken to be a threat. The first report from Clara was confirming. Isabella Rossi was living in a penthouse apartment in a new hyper-modern downtown condo building. The lease Clara discovered was not in her name. It was held by Rosso Corsa Designs, LLC, and the bills were paid directly from the account Julian was funding. It was a lavish love nest paid for by the Vance family fortune. The surveillance team tracked their movements. They met 3, sometimes 4 times a week. Intimate dinners, weekend trips to a private vineyard, and late-night rendezvous at her apartment. Julian was completely besotted. But Clara's team noticed something odd. "She's meticulous," Clara told Eleanor over a secure phone line. "Almost professionally so. She never uses her personal phone in public. She sweeps her car for trackers. Our guys saw her do it. She varies her routes to and from her apartment. This isn't the behavior of a typical 20-something designer enjoying her sugar daddy. This is tradecraft." The word sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. Tradecraft. The real breakthrough came when Clara's digital forensics expert, a hacker who went by the name Orion, managed to dig into the origins of Rosso Corsa Designs, LLC. The company was registered in Delaware, a notorious corporate haven. But the IP address used to file the initial registration documents didn't trace back to Isabella or Julian. It traced back to a small, unassuming office building. The building's primary tenant, a subsidiary holding company owned by Thorne Industries. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "So Thorne set up her company. It's more than that," Clara said, her voice tight with excitement. "Orion dug into her finances. The initial seed money to open the Rosso Corsa bank account, a modest $10,000, didn't come from Julian. It came from the same Thorne subsidiary 3 months before her first payment from Julian. He didn't set her up in business. Marcus Thorne did." The pieces were no longer just clicking into place. They were forming a horrifying mosaic. Isabella wasn't just a beautiful woman who had caught the eye of two rival billionaires. She was an asset, and Marcus Thorne had deployed her first. Eleanor's mind raced back through the past year. Julian had become increasingly obsessed with the Odyssey Tower, his legacy project. He boasted constantly about its revolutionary, eco-friendly design, its proprietary smart building technology, and the complex multi-phase financing structure he had personally devised to fund it. It was his masterpiece, but it was also his greatest vulnerability. He had poured all of his company's capital and a mountain of personal debt into it. If the Odyssey Tower failed, Vance Holdings would crumble. "Clara," Eleanor said, her voice low and urgent. "What else is she doing besides sleeping with my husband?" "My team has eyes on her," Clara responded. "Last night, she didn't meet with Julian. She met with someone else at a quiet hotel bar. We got a photo." A moment later, an image appeared on Eleanor's phone. It was Isabella, looking chic and serious in a black pantsuit. Sitting across from her was a man Eleanor recognized from business journals. He was Daniel Jones, Marcus Thorne's chief financial officer. They weren't holding hands. They were looking at a tablet, their heads close together, deep in conversation. In the photo, Isabella was passing a small, sleek USB drive to him across the table. Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs. It was happening. It was real. "She's feeding them information," Eleanor whispered. "The consulting services are a lie. He's not paying her for interior design advice. He's paying her to be a corporate spun." Julian, in his arrogance, had brought a viper into his bed. He thought he was paying for a beautiful, admiring young mistress. In reality, he was funding his own destruction. He was so blinded by his ego and his infatuation that he was personally delivering the confidential data of his life's work, financial models, architectural plans, investor lists to his greatest enemy. "Ellie, this is bigger than a divorce settlement," Clara said soberly. "This is corporate espionage. We're talking about market manipulation, intellectual property theft. If Thorne uses this information to undercut the Odyssey project, Julian will be ruined, wiped out." A year ago, that news would have devastated her. A month ago, it would have terrified her. But now, sitting in the cold, sterile kitchen of the life Julian had mocked, Eleanor felt a strange, terrifying calm. He had wanted to divest from his starter wife. He had called her a non-performing asset. He had no idea that this asset had just uncovered the conspiracy that was about to bring his entire empire crashing down. The question was no longer how she would leave him, but when and how spectacularly she would let it all burn. The revelation that Isabella was a corporate scent was a bombshell, but for Eleanor and Clara, it was only the beginning. It explained the what, but not the who. Who was Isabella Rossi, really? A woman with the skills to run a sophisticated intelligence operation against a man like Julian Vance wasn't just some up-and-coming designer. "People like this don't just appear," Clara explained during their next strategy session, held in the soundproofed basement of her firm's discreet office. "They have a history. Or more likely, they have a history they've worked very hard to erase." Orion Clara's digital phantom was tasked with digging deeper, not into Rosso Corsa designs, but into Isabella herself. He started with the basics: birth records, university transcripts, social security numbers. And he hit a brick wall. The Isabella Rossi Julian, new the one featured in society blogs and draped on his arm at galas, had a curated, flawless online presence, a degree in design from a prestigious Italian university, glowing references from supposed former employers in Milan and Paris, a backstory of a wealthy Italian family who had tragically passed away, leaving her to make her own way in the world. It was a perfect romantic narrative, and it was completely fake. Her university has no record of her, Clara reported to Eleanor a few days later, her voice grim. The design firms she supposedly worked for in Europe, they've never heard of her. Her social security number was issued only 3 years ago. Before that, according to the US government, Isabella Rossi did not exist. She was a ghost, a carefully constructed identity, a legend created for a single purpose: to infiltrate Julian Vance's life. Eleanor felt a chill. This wasn't just a greedy woman taking advantage of a rich man. This was a professional operation. Marcus Thorne hadn't just hired a beautiful woman. He had deployed a trained operative. "We need to find out who she really is," Eleanor insisted. "There has to be a crack somewhere. A mistake." Orion kept digging. He analyzed the metadata of photos she had posted years ago, looking for clues. He ran facial recognition software against international databases. For a week, there was nothing. Then he found it. A tiny digital thread left dangling. It was a photo from 4 years ago on an obscure, forgotten travel blog, posted under a different name, Katya Petrova. The photo was of a group of students on an exchange program in London. In the back row, almost hidden, was a younger, less polished version of Isabella, but with the same unmistakable eyes, the same fiery hair. The name Katya Petrova was the key that unlocked everything. There was no tragic Italian inheritance. Katya Petrova was born in a bleak industrial city in Eastern Europe. Her father was a low-level factory worker, her mother a cleaner. But Katya was brilliant, especially with numbers and languages. She earned a scholarship to study economics at a university in Moscow, where records showed she graduated at the top of her class. And then things got murky. After university, she didn't take a job at a bank or a corporation. She dropped off the map for 2 years. When she resurfaced, it was with a new name, a new passport, and a new life story, as Isabella Rossi. Moscow, Clara mused, looking at the file. She was recruited. Maybe not by a government, but by one of the private corporate intelligence firms that are thick on the ground there. Ex-spies, ex-military. They train people in honey-trapping, blackmail, and infiltration. They're mercenaries for hire. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Orion, using the new name, uncovered a crucial connection. A discreet security consulting firm, based in Switzerland, but with strong ties to Moscow, had Marcus Thorne's parent company, Thorne Industries, on its client list. The full picture was now terrifyingly clear. Marcus Thorne, frustrated by his inability to beat Julian in the open market, had decided to play dirty. He'd hired a firm of corporate mercenaries. They, in turn, had provided him with their best operative, Katya Petrova. They had built her a new identity as Isabella Rossi, complete with a plausible backstory, and had inserted her into the social circles where she would inevitably cross paths with the notoriously egotistical Julian Vance. Katya, or Isabella, had done the rest. She had played her part, perfectly preying on Julian's vanity, his desire for a younger, more branded partner. She made him feel like a king, all the while systematically stealing the keys to his kingdom. The payments he made to Rosso Corsa Designs weren't just for her silence or her affection. They were, in effect, his payment to the very people orchestrating his ruin. He was literally financing his own demise. Eleanor sat in stunned silence, the file open on the table in front of her. She looked at the picture of the young Katya Petrova, the determined girl from a factory town. There was a hardness in her eyes even then. She felt a flicker of something that wasn't quite sympathy, but a kind of grim understanding. Katya was a survivor, a predator who had used the tools available to her to escape her circumstances. Julian, on the other hand, had been born into comfort and had spent his life believing he was the smartest man in any room. His arrogance was the fatal flaw that Katya had so expertly exploited. He saw a beautiful object of desire. She saw a mark. "What do we do now?" Eleanor asked, her voice quiet. "Do I go to him? Warn him?" Clara shook her head. "And say what? Honey, your mistress is a corporate sin sent by your arch-rival to destroy you. He won't believe you. He'll think you're a jealous, hysterical wife making up insane stories to get a better divorce settlement. He'll double down, protect her, and you'll be left with nothing." Clara was right. Julian's ego wouldn't allow him to accept that he had been so completely and utterly played. He would see it as an attack on his judgment, his masculinity. "So what's the plan?" Eleanor pressed. "Thorne is going to make his move soon. The final bids for the waterfront project are due in 2 weeks. He'll use the information Isabella has stolen to gut Julian's proposal and secure the deal. That, combined with the compromised financing of the Odyssey Tower, will be the kill shot." Clara leaned back, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. "Julian thinks the game is between him and Thorne. He has no idea there's a third player at the table now. You." She tapped the file on Katya Petrova. "She has a weakness. Everyone does. Her entire existence as Isabella Rossi is a fabrication. It's a house of cards. What we have here isn't just leverage for a divorce. It's a detonator. The question is, where and when do we want to set it off for maximum impact?" Eleanor thought of the humiliation at Aria, the cold dismissal in Julian's eyes, the casual cruelty of the starter wife comment. She thought of the years she had sacrificed, the dreams she had deferred. He had wanted to erase her from his story. Now she would be the one to write the final chapter. "There's a press conference next week," Eleanor said, her voice turning to ice. "Julian is officially breaking ground on the Odyssey Tower. He's invited every major journalist and investor in the city. He'll be on a stage celebrating his grand triumph." Clara's smile widened. How beautifully poetic. A public celebration for a public execution. The plan began to form, not one of simple revenge, but of complete and total annihilation. They wouldn't just expose the affair. They would expose everything. The spy, the rival, the conspiracy. They would let Julian climb to the absolute pinnacle of his hubris, and then, in front of the entire world, they would kick the ladder out from under him. The grand atrium of the newly completed Vance Holdings headquarters was a cathedral of modern capitalism. A 3-story wall of glass overlooked the downtown core, and at the center of the bustling space stood a detailed architectural model of the Odyssey Tower. Today, it was the stage for Julian Vance's magnum opus, the official groundbreaking press conference. The room was packed. Journalists jostled for position, investors in sharp suits murmured excitedly, and city officials stood ready to offer their endorsements. Julian was at the podium, beaming the very picture of a titan at the apex of his power. Eleanor watched from the back of the room, almost invisible in a simple, dark grey suit. She looked like just another corporate spouse present, but peripheral. No one could guess the storm she was about to unleash. In her purse was a slim envelope, and on a secure server, Clara and Orion stood by ready. Standing near the front, in a place of honor, was Isabella Rossi. She wore a stunning white dress, a stark and brilliant contrast to Eleanor's quiet grey. She looked every bit the part of the victor, the finishing partner. Occasionally she would catch Julian's eye, and offer him a subtle, encouraging smile, the smile of a handler confirming the success of an operation. Julian began his speech, his voice booming with practiced confidence. He spoke of vision, of legacy, of building the future. He thanked his team, the city, and his investors. It was a symphony of self-congratulation. "The Odyssey Tower is more than just a building," he declared, his arms spread wide. "It is a statement, a testament to the fact that with enough ambition and the right partners, anything is possible." As he spoke, Eleanor began to move. She walked slowly, deliberately along the edge of the room, her path taking her directly towards the stage. A few heads turned, but most were still fixated on Julian. He was reaching his crescendo. And I have to thank the incredible creative visionaries who have helped shape this project, particularly the brilliant design consultant whose fresh perspective has been invaluable. Ms. Isabella Rossi. He gestured to Isabella, who gave a modest, beautiful smile as a ripple of polite applause went through the room. This was her public anointing, the moment of her official arrival. And it was Eleanor's cue. As the applause died down, she reached the side of the stage. A security guard moved to intercept her, but she simply said, "I'm Eleanor Vance." The name still carried enough weight to make him hesitate. In that moment of hesitation, she stepped up onto the stage. A confused murmur spread through the crowd. Julian stopped, his smile frozen on his face, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "Ellie, what are you doing?" he hissed under his breath. Isabella's professional poise wavered for the first time. A flicker of alarm of a mission going off script crossed her face. Eleanor walked calmly to the podium, standing beside her stunned husband. She didn't look at him. She looked out at the sea of faces at the flashing cameras of the press. "My apologies for the interruption," she said, her voice amplified by the microphone, clear and steady. "My husband is a man of grand visions, but sometimes in focusing on the grand vision, you miss the crucial details." She turned to him, her eyes locking onto his. "You're right, Julian. Having the right partners is everything, which is why I think it's time everyone here knew exactly who your partners are." She turned her gaze to Isabella, whose face had gone pale. "You all know this woman as Isabella Rossi, a brilliant designer." Eleanor's voice was laced with ice. "A touching story. A self-made woman from a wealthy Italian family. It's a beautiful fiction." From her purse, she pulled out a printed photograph. It was the grainy image from the travel blog. She held it up. On the massive screens behind the stage, which were supposed to be showing renderings of the Odyssey Tower, the photo suddenly appeared magnified for all to see. Clara's team was in control. Her real name, Eleanor announced to the stunned room, is Katya Petrova. She was born in a factory town outside of Omsk. Her degree isn't from Milan. It's in economics from Moscow. And she isn't a designer. She is a highly trained corporate intelligence operative. A collective gasp went through the atrium. Julian stared dumbfounded, first at the screen, then at Isabella, then back at Eleanor. "Ellie, this is insane. You're hysterical." "Am I?" Eleanor didn't falter. On the screens, the picture of Katya was replaced by a new image, the surveillance photo of her meeting with Marcus Thorne's CFO, Daniel Jones, the USB drive clearly visible between them. "This is Isabella, 2 nights ago," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the rising clamor. She wasn't meeting a lighting supplier. She was meeting with the senior leadership of Thorne Industries. She was delivering her latest report. She finally turned to face Julian, her eyes blazing with 15 years of suppressed fury. "You have been sleeping with the enemy, Julian. You've been so blinded by your own ego, so desperate to replace your starter wife with a newer model that you failed to see you weren't seducing a mistress. You were being targeted by a spy." She pointed to the model of the Odyssey Tower. "Every proprietary detail of this project, the financial structures, the engineering innovations, the confidential investor lists you have personally delivered via your brilliant consultant directly into the hands of your greatest rival, Marcus Thorne." The room erupted into chaos. Investors were on their phones, their faces grim. Journalists were shouting questions. Julian looked at Isabella, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. "Is this true?" he whispered, his voice cracking. Isabella or Katya stood frozen for a moment. Her cover was not just blown, it had been nuked from orbit. The mask of the adoring designer fell away, replaced by the cold, hard expression of Katya Petrova, the operative. Without a word, she turned and walked swiftly off the stage, pushing through the stunned crowd and heading for the exit. There was no denial. There didn't need to be. Her flight was its own confession. Now Eleanor addressed the room one last time, her voice ringing with authority. "As co-owner of the assets of Vance Holdings, I have already instructed my legal team to file for an immediate injunction on this project, pending a full investigation into the catastrophic security breach and intellectual property theft orchestrated by Thorne Industries." She turned to her husband. The titan of industry looked small, broken, his face ashen. The foundation of his world had just been pulverized in under 5 minutes. "You wanted to divest from me, Julian?" Eleanor said, her voice now a low, devastating whisper, meant only for him. "Consider this my hostile takeover." She placed the envelope from her purse on the podium in front of him. "These are divorce papers. My lawyer, Mr. Carlyle, I believe you know him, will be in touch." She walked off the stage, her back straight, her head held high. She didn't look back at the ruin of the man she had once loved. She walked through the pandemonium, past the horrified faces of their friends and colleagues, and out the grand glass doors into the sunlight of her new, uncertain, but finally free life. The fallout was immediate and brutal. The press conference intended to be Julian's coronation became his public execution. The story was a Molotov cocktail of sex, corporate espionage, and high society betrayal, a media firestorm that no PR firm could contain. Vance's Odyssey, a spy tower mistress revealed as corporate spy for rival Thorne. Titan of real estate duped the honey trap that could topple an empire. The headlines were merciless. The stock price of Vance Holdings' publicly traded subsidiary plummeted by 60% in the first day of trading. Investors who had been cheering for Julian a day earlier were now screaming for his head. The carefully constructed house of cards that was the Odyssey Tower's financing collapsed as key backers, spooked by the security breach and the impending lawsuits, pulled their funding. Julian was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. He tried to fight back, holding a disastrous press conference where he appeared disheveled and frantic, blaming everything on his unstable, vengeful wife. But the evidence Eleanor had provided was too compelling. When journalists, prompted by anonymous tips from Clara's firm, unearthed the wire transfers to Rosso Corsa Designs, the shell company set up by Thorne Industries, Julian's denials became laughable. He tried to call Isabella, but her number was disconnected. He went to her penthouse apartment, but it was empty, professionally wiped clean of any evidence she had ever been there. Katya Petrova had vanished as completely as Isabella Rossi had appeared. She was a ghost in the wind, her mission accomplished. Marcus Thorne played his part with chilling precision. He publicly denied any knowledge of Ms. Rossi's activities, painting her as a rogue consultant. But behind the scenes, he moved in for the kill. With the confidential data she had provided, he presented a revised, unbeatable bid for the waterfront development project, effectively boxing Julian out and securing the city's most lucrative real estate prize. He used the stolen investor lists to approach Julian's wavering partners, offering them safe haven and better terms at Thorn Industries. It was a corporate massacre. Julian's empire crumbled brick by brick. The injunction filed by Eleanor froze his assets. The board of directors, facing shareholder lawsuits and a crisis of confidence, forced him to step down as CEO. The man who had stood on stage as a king was now a pariah, locked out of his own office, his name synonymous with hubris and failure. He was adrift, stripped of his power, his reputation, and his wealth. His so-called friends, the ones who had clapped him on the back and laughed at his jokes, now crossed the street to avoid him. In his desperation, he did the one thing he had left to do. He went to the family home, the one he had shared with Eleanor, hoping to beg, to reason, to intimidate his way back into some semblance of his old life. He found her in the garden, the same place she'd been when he'd offered his pathetic non-apology. This time, however, she wasn't pruning roses. She was meeting with a landscape architect, discussing plans to tear out the severe minimalist rock gardens Julian had insisted upon and replace them with something full of life and color. He stood there, a man reduced, watching her. She was different. There was a lightness in her posture, a confidence in her smile that had been absent for years. She was no longer Mrs. Julian Vance. She was Eleanor. "What do you want, Julian?" she asked when she finally noticed him, her tone calm and businesslike. "Ellie, we have to talk," he stammered. "You can't do this. You're destroying everything we built." She raised an eyebrow. "What did we build? No, Julian. We built a partnership in a tiny apartment with nothing but dreams. You built a monument to your own ego, and you were so busy admiring it that you didn't notice the foundations were rotten." "It was a mistake," he pleaded, his voice raw. "She played me. She played us." "No," Eleanor corrected him, her voice quiet but unyielding. "She played you. I was just the non-performing asset you were planning to liquidate. Remember your starter wife." The words hit him with the force of a physical blow. He saw it then, the full scope of his catastrophic misjudgment. He hadn't just underestimated his enemy. He had completely and utterly failed to appreciate his greatest ally. He had treated the bedrock of his life like disposable rubble. "I can fix this," he said, a desperate, hollow promise. "I'll get the money back. We can rebuild." Eleanor gave a sad, small shake of her head. "There is no we, Julian. There is no rebuilding. You set fire to our house to keep your new toy warm. Now the house is gone, and your toy was a bomb. All you have left is the ashes." She turned back to her meeting, a clear and final dismissal. He was no longer a part of her world. He was a ghost from a past life. Julian stood there for a long time, watching the woman he had discarded redesigning the world he had lost. He had mocked her for being a part of his past, a relic of his beginning. He now understood that she hadn't been his starter wife. She had been his enter foundation, and he had dynamited it with his own 2 hands. He was utterly and irrevocably destroyed. A year later, the name Julian Vance was a cautionary tale whispered in the boardrooms and country clubs where he was once revered. After a brutal, messy divorce, in which Eleanor, armed with irrefutable evidence of both infidelity and financial malfeasance, secured a majority of their liquid assets, Julian was forced to declare personal bankruptcy. The shell of Vance Holdings was bought for pennies on the dollar by a vulture fund. The Odyssey Tower project was mired in litigation, a half-dug hole in the ground, serving as a monument to his hubris. He was last seen living in a rented condo, a shadow of the man he once was, his calls to former colleagues going unreturned. Marcus Thorne had won, but his victory was tainted. The scandal had brought unwelcome scrutiny on his own business practices, and while he was never formally charged, the taint of espionage clung to him, making future partners wary. He had his prize, but he had revealed to the world just how dirty he was willing to play to get it. As for Katya Petrova, she had vanished without a trace, likely with a new name and a new face waiting for her next assignment. She was a professional, and the destruction of Julian Vance was just another successful entry in her resume. But this story was no longer about them. It was about Eleanor. She didn't stay in the cavernous mansion. She sold it, shedding the last vestiges of a life that had been built to impress others. With the proceeds and her settlement, she bought a beautiful historic brownstone in a quieter part of the city, one with character and warmth. More importantly, she went back to her first love. She opened her own boutique architectural firm, Eleanor Vance Design. She didn't want to build monolithic skyscrapers that scraped the sky. Her focus was on creating spaces that nurtured life-sustainable community centers, beautifully designed affordable housing and public parks that brought nature back into the urban landscape. Her first project was a pro bono design for a new women's shelter, a place for those escaping situations like the one she had almost been trapped in. She poured her heart into it, designing a space that was not just safe, but beautiful, filled with light and hope. On a crisp autumn afternoon, she stood on the construction site of that shelter, a hard hat on her head, looking over a set of blueprints. Her children, Daniel and Sophie, now living with her in the new brownstone, were thriving away from the cold tension of their old home. She was not just their mother. She was their role model, a woman who had faced betrayal and ruin and had chosen not to be a victim, but to be a builder. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Clara. Heard a rumor Thorne is being investigated by the SEC. Looks like karma is finally warming up in the bullpen. Drink tonight to celebrate. Eleanor smiled and texted back, Absolutely. She looked up at the steel frame of the new building taking shape against the blue sky. It was strong, honest, and built for a purpose. It was her foundation. Julian had been wrong. She was never a starter wife. She was the architect of her own life, and she was finally, after 15 long years, breaking ground on her masterpiece. And that's the story of how Julian Vance's world came crashing down. It wasn't just his mistress's secret that destroyed him. It was his own arrogance. He saw his wife Eleanor as a relic of his past, forgetting that she was the one who helped lay the very foundation of his success. He learned the hard way that when you try to discard people, you never know what power and resilience you're truly throwing away. Eleanor's journey from a heartbroken wife to the architect of her own destiny is a powerful reminder that our greatest strength is often forged in the fires of betrayal. What would you have done in Eleanor's shoes? Would you have warned him, or would you have let the empire he built on your sacrifices crumble? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a story of epic downfall and powerful rebirth, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life drama. Thank you for listening.